Welcome to this edition of News Today, a series in which we discuss and briefly analyze the important news of the day. Let's have a look at today's main headlines. The State Bank of India report moots inducting more business correspondents. The PRS Legislative Research releases the State of State Finances 2023-24 report. The UNICEF releases the report titled The Climate Changed Child, a Children's Climate Risk Index Supplement. Once-in-a-century flooding swamps Somalia after the historic drought, says the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The UNFCCC Secretariat releases the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement Synthesis Report 2023. The Niti Aayog releases the report Learnings for Large-Scale Transformation in School Education. Starting with the first main news, the State Bank of India reports moots inducting more women business correspondents. Before we look at the report, let's first understand about business correspondents. They are retail agents engaged by the banks to provide banking services at the locations other than a bank branch or an ATM and help reach banking services in rural and remote parts of the country. For instance, the Bank Sakhi or the female banker friend model. RBI launched the banking correspondence model in 2006 to expand the financial inclusion in the country. They aid in dispersal and collection of small value credit, receipts, and the delivery of small value remittances, sale of products like microinsurance, pensions, to name a few. Coming back to the key highlights of the report. Presently, women agents comprise less than 10% of the business correspondent workforce. The report says that this should be increased to 30%. Also, due to socio-economic constraints limiting job options, female agents are less prone to malpractice and are more dedicated. Plus, increasing women's involvement in the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana improved the financial status of female borrowers. Additionally, women customers find women agents easier to approach, trustworthy, and are great at maintaining confidentiality. From this, we can realize the significance of the women business correspondents as they potentially act as role models for financial inclusion. Having said this, there are certain challenges as well. These include the lack of digital literacy, inadequate training, low and irregular income, limited mobility, and the associated security risks. Moving on, the PRS Legislative Research releases the State of State Finances 2023-24 report. Let's have a look at the key highlights of the report. The report says that states' revenue receipts have returned to the pre-pandemic level. However, when it comes to the revenue deficit, despite the revenue deficit grants by the centre, several states have continued to face revenue deficits. The report also highlights the impact of GST. Herein, the state goods and services tax collections as a percentage of gross state domestic product remain below the pre-GST levels. Also, with the GST compensation grants having ended in June 2022, there has been an adverse impact on some states. The next key aspect of the report is the expenditure on subsidies. Over the last several years, states have allocated 8 to 9% of their revenue to subsidies, mainly for power. Also, there is a noticeable increase in subsidies for non-merit goods in various states. Additionally, in the year 2021-22, state discoms cut financial losses, but many still carry a substantial debt. This is a contingent liability for states and poses financial risks. When it comes to the capital outlay by the states, they continue to have a high level of committed expenditure and persistent revenue deficit, thus constraining capital outlay. Also, the states' off-budget borrowings have decreased. Off-budget borrowings are raised by the government-owned entities, but the interest and principal of such loans are serviced from the government budget. Moving on to the next news, UNICEF releases the report titled The Climate Changed Child, a Children's Climate Risk Index Supplement. Before we go deep into the report, let's understand some basics about UNICEF. UNICEF was established in 1946 as the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. Its headquarters are in New York. Coming back to the report, it builds on the UNICEF's Children Climate Risk Index components, which were water scarcity and water vulnerability, which is the combination of water scarcity and the lack of access to drinking water service. Let's have a look at the key findings of the report. The report says almost 1 billion children are exposed to high or extremely high water stress. Countries namely India, Niger, Eritrea, Yemen, and Burkina Faso had the highest overall child exposure to high or extremely high water vulnerability. The report also says that children, particularly in low income communities, are highly susceptible to the negative effects of the climate change. Having said this, let's have a look at the impact of climate change on children. Herein, killer childhood diseases are spreading more because of climate change. As infants are less able to regulate body temperature, this makes them vulnerable during heat waves. Also, children are more likely to suffer from air pollution than adults, and on top of it, climate change aggravates child malnutrition through crop failures and rising food prices. Additionally, the increased disasters disrupt the education of around 40 million children annually. Before we conclude this news, let's have a look at some key recommendations. There is a need to elevate children in COP28 decisions and convene expert dialogue. Also, there is a need to embed children and intergenerational equity in the global stocktake. The recommendations also want to include children and climate-resilient essential services in the global goal for adaptation. Additionally, making the loss and damage fund child responsive will also help in this regard. In another news, once-in-a-century flooding swamped Somalia after a historic drought. As per the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, heavy seasonal rainfall has been worsened due to the combined impact of two climate phenomena, El Nino and the Indian Ocean Dipole. Across the Horn of Africa, El Nino and a positive IOD or the Indian Ocean Dipole are associated with the above normal rains and flooding. Let's understand in more details about El Nino and the Indian Ocean Dipole. Starting with El Nino, it is a climate pattern associated with the warming of ocean surface temperatures in the central and the eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. Generally, El Nino occurs on an average every 2 to 7 years, and it can lead to the weakening of the monsoon circulation over the Indian subcontinent. Coming to the Indian Ocean Dipole or IOD, it is also known as the Indian Nino. It refers to the difference in the sea surface temperatures between the eastern and the western side of the Indian Ocean. It has three phases. Positive IOD is when the western side is warmer than the eastern side. Negative IOD is when there is a cooler western side and a warmer eastern side. Neutral IOD is when the temperatures are close to normal across the Indian Ocean. Moving on to the next news, the UNFCCC Secretariat releases the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement Synthesis Report 2023. Before we look into the report, let's first understand some basics about UNFCCC and the Nationally Determined Contributions or the NDC. UNFCCC Secretariat is tasked with supporting the global response to the threat of the climate change. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change or the UNFCCC, adopted in 1992, is the parent treaty of the Paris Agreement. The NDCs are countries' self-defined national climate pledges under the Paris Agreement to reduce the national emissions and adapt to the impacts of the climate change. Coming back to the report, it analyzed the NDCs of the 195 parties to the Paris Agreement. Let's have a look at the key highlights of the report. The report highlights that the world is off track to the Paris Agreement goals. This is because implementing latest NDCs will increase emissions by approximately 8.8% by 2030 relative to the 2010 levels. Emissions need to be cut by 45% by 2030 compared to the 2010 levels to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. When it comes to the indigenous peoples and local communities, 40% of the parties outlined the role of local communities and rights of indigenous peoples in adaptation components of the NDCs. This includes addressing specific vulnerabilities of indigenous peoples and emphasizing the importance of utilizing indigenous knowledge to enhance climate efforts. Additionally, the report says that the parties increasingly are recognizing gender integration as a means to enhance the ambition and effectiveness of their climate actions. In this regard, let's have a look at some of the key recommendations. To achieve emission peaking before 2030, essential factors include enhanced access to financial resources, technology transfer, and availability of market-based mechanisms. In another news, the Niti Aayog releases the report Learnings for Large-Scale Transformation in School Education. This is the outcome report on the sustainable action for transforming human capital in education project implemented in Jharkhand, Odisha and Madhya Pradesh. The project was launched by Niti Aayog in 2017. Let's have a look at some of the key findings of the report. The report says that despite similar enrollment, India has 5 times more schools than China. Over 50% of the primary schools in many Indian states enroll fewer than 60 students. Also, approximately 2 to 5 lakh untrained teachers in primary and upper primary levels have failed to meet the right to education requirements. Among the states, Jharkhand merged 4,380 schools, resulting in the savings of Rs 400 crore through the reduced teacher and infrastructure requirement, thus optimizing resources. The report has suggested 6 areas for education transformation. These include addressing subscale schools, inadequately resourced schools with political support, solving teacher vacancies via restructuring and recruitment, which can be done via cadre restructuring, rethinking teacher education to improve quality, enforcing learning outcome accountability and competency-based assessment reforms, focusing on early childhood education and multilingual education, and finally, strengthening governance in education departments for self-improvement. Also, there are some other recommendations in this regard, like merging small and low enrollment schools with the nearby ones, and the states need to consider the decentralization of powers to principals, districts and block officers. The place in the news for today is Tuvalu. Australia inked an agreement with Tuvalu to offer residency to its citizens displaced by climate change. Tuvalu, with its capital Funafuti, is a nation of 9 coral islands and is not landlocked. Its bordering nations are Kiribati and Nauru, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, Tokelau and Fiji, Samoa, Wallis and Futuna, and Tonga. It is located in the midway between Hawaii and Australia in the South Pacific Ocean. It is believed to be the first nation to face the climate change-induced complete submersion. Coming to its geographical features, it is an archipelago which is volcanic in origin and includes both atolls and reef islands. Its largest atoll is Funafuti. As we conclude today's main news, let's go through some quick updates. India has reportedly requested evidence from US under the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty or MLAT in connection with the attack on Indian consulate in San Francisco. MLAT is a bilateral treaty that provides a mechanism for seeking assistance from other contracting states in civil and criminal matters. As per the National Organ and Tissue Transplant Organization data, 80% of organ recipients in India between 1995 and 2021 were men. The organization has been set up under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. The National Health Authority and the Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority of India have joined hands to operationalize the National Health Claim Exchange. Few Indian businessmen have got a golden passport. It is a facility offered by certain countries where foreigners can get citizenship through significant investments. 6 Indian restaurants from around the world were awarded the Annapurna certificate. The Annapurna certificate program is to recognize restaurants abroad that promote Indian culinary and cuisine traditions. A researcher unveiled the capability of Picocytosis salinarum found in the hypersaline soda lake Sambar in Rajasthan to survive extreme environments. Cytodactylus warringtonensis is a newly discovered species of gecko and named after the town Warrington in Mizoram where it was discovered. The Mars solar conjunction impacted the NASA robotic probes on the planet Mars. During this phenomena, the Sun comes between the Earth and Mars. Before we go, it's time to put your knowledge to the test in today's segment of Test Your Learning. Thank you for joining us. We hope you have enjoyed this edition of News Today. To get the answer to today's quiz and to download the PDF of News Today, make sure to check out the links in the description below.